Can you tell me what's happening at the moment?
Well, we're just leading quite a big crowd off to a teach out at I think still a top secret location, appropriately chosen somewhere else in the city, where there's going to be a discussion about how do we get systemic change. So what sort of things should we be calling for? How do we organise? What are the next steps from here? That sort of those sort of questions are the ones we're going to try and address. There's 4 speakers kind of doing a bit of an introduction. There's me, there's Polly Toynbee, who writes for The Guardian, someone from the Tax Justice Network, and Jonathan Portis, who's director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. We're going to be doing a bit of an intro about the kind of crisis we're in and the sort of responses we might be looking for to try and get out of it. So that's what's going on, and we'll see how it goes.
And that's part of the organised activities of Occupy.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the whole thing's incredibly well organised, and this is one of the things that some of the people have decided was a good idea. It's been agreed on to do it, so we'll see how this goes and then sort of report back to the General Assembly later.
And how has the occupation been going this week?
Well, I think at the camp? Yeah, I've been sort of in and out like lots of people. I think some people have been really very dedicated and have stayed there all week, and that's been the core of what's going on. But you can just look round and just see how well everything's functioning, the way the assemblies operate as a sort of pooling of intelligence and information and a way of making decisions. You can see the basic functions of the place, like the kitchen's up and running, there's a library organised, there's what's been rather grandly labelled as Tent City University, where there's regular talks and this sort of thing. So there's all sorts going on, and I think it's been very, very positive.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
No problem.
I've got a picture. I'll show it to you.
Just listen for the disapproving areas at the back.
I mean, the march was unlistened by
the Tent City University's first major teach out event. When we gathered a week ago, we were a collection of disparate, nervous, cold men and women from different places, different races, different classes, different nationalities and sexualities. And we didn't know where the next few days were going to take us. Well, this is our 1 week anniversary. To celebrate that 1 week anniversary, and as part of the movement we're building, we have 4 excellent speakers who are here to talk about the state we're in, economically, politically and socially. What we're going to do then over the next 2 hours is listen to these guys tell us their opinions about what's wrong and what we can do about it. Then we're going to have questions from everybody here, opinions from everybody here, and small breakout sessions all around on the steps where everyone else has a chance to share their opinions before we come back together here and hopefully come to some form of consensus about what we think's going on, what we think we can do about it. Briefly, the Tent City University, which I think you've all probably seen by now, the gigantic marquee that we've got in amidst the tents, is the place that we've built as part of the Occupy London movement to bring people together to share ideas, to learn and to teach. We're trying to build a non-hierarchical learning and teaching structure, bringing people from all backgrounds to share their expertise and to learn from each other. And today, as I say, is our first major outreach event along precisely those lines. So I'm going to hand over now to James, who's going to read out the first statement that we agreed upon on the first General Assembly. And Carrie subsequently is going to introduce our speakers. So I hope you enjoy the next couple of hours.
Great, welcome everybody. We thought that it would be most appropriate to frame the discussion and teaching today by using our first statement, which we had developed together, and I wanted to begin by reading it out. And this will be the statement essentially that we're putting to the 4 speakers today, and that we're going to take to our breakout groups to really take forward discussing the nuts and bolts of how are we going to address the broken system that we live within. So I'm sure everybody's been reading the statement and it's been in the media, but to remind ourselves and to all be on the same page here, this is the first statement. The current system is unsustainable. It is undemocratic and unjust. We need alternatives. This is where we work towards them.
Hello, and we have our first speaker, Polly Toynbee.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to salute the Occupy London movement. I think in the first week it's been quite astonishing how much discussion has happened as a direct result of you all being there. I've been amazed the extent to which even the mainstream media has been really quite sympathetic in a lot of its coverage. On Monday, there was the most remarkable editorial in the Financial Times saying people should take heed to what you're saying, repeating a great deal of what you've been saying. And I think that's astonishing, an astonishing achievement. Today, even the Daily Telegraph has something in it which is not too opposed. All the way through, last night on Any Questions, which was happening in a grammar school in Devon, not necessarily a place you would absolutely expect to be on your side. When the audience was asked which side they were on, the majority were on your side. There's no doubt that there is a very strong sense that things have gone badly wrong. The 99% is what people feel. They know, they see, they read about what's happened with the 1%, how money has been sucked upwards from the bottom over the last few decades. I just thought I'd start by this, because this is, not a rally, it's a discussion, a teach-in, a forum for thinking up new ideas, new solutions. I think the proposals that have come up so far are very impressive, but that's, as was said at the time, a work in progress. And the idea of a teaching and universities and a forum for new ideas to come forward is a really important part of this, and is a reason why people will keep visiting Tent City, because they'll want to join in the discussions and hear what's going on. So I think this is a really creative way of going about it. But I just thought I would throw in a few facts which will be known to some of you but perhaps not to others, and it's certainly known to everybody instinctively from their own experience. FTSE 100 CEOs this year had a 32% rise in their already enormous pay packages. Only 1 in 4 other people had any rise at all, and 1 in 20 had a pay cut. Half the population, according to the Resolution Foundation, has had no real rise in its living standards at all since 2003. It's been static, it's been stagnant. So when in the boom years people talked about GDP growth, it was growth that was only at the very top. It wasn't for those in the middle, let alone for those at the bottom. Meanwhile, Bob Diamond of Barclays has this year a £6.2 million bonus, just bonus, and he says time for remorse is over. The Institute for Fiscal Studies this week has come out with a report saying that average living standards, real living standards, will drop this year by 7%, the biggest drop there's been in living memory, and it's unlikely to rise again. That means the average household needs to earn £736 this year just to stand in the same place due to inflation and cuts. The austerity that we're all suffering, and some much more than others, isn't working either to reduce the deficit significantly. A report came out today, you can find it on Left Foot Forward by an economist, saying that of the 16 billion extra that's been cut, real cuts that affect people's lives hugely, the police over there cut by 20%, a third of their police stations being closed down before you look at all the rest of the public sector. Of that 16 billion that's been cut this year, of every £4 cut, only 75p has gone to reducing the deficit. So we're getting the pain and no gain, or very little gain. It's not actually working. Meanwhile, child poverty set to rise by 300,000. 200,000 more public sector workers are losing their jobs this year than was predicted or expected by the government's own figures. You know that nearly 1 million young people are unemployed, unlikely to get jobs. You know how hard young people have been hit with the EMA, with university fees, with benefits. Growth is near zero, and it's worst in the UK amongst the big countries because our austerity is worst, and that has been something of our government's choosing. It hasn't been an act of God. Meanwhile, banks are hoarding their money, they're not lending. There was something called Project Merlin, by which they were meant to agree to let the money out. Quantitative easing has poured money into them, they're hoarding it. The latest figures came out yesterday. They're lending 2.5 billion less in the last quarter to small businesses, not more. Food banks, a new one is opening every week because the demand of the absolutely desperate for food parcels has grown so much more. Now, we know that there are better ways of running the economy. We know that there are better ways out of this crisis by going for growth, by going for jobs, by not paying down the deficit and not having cuts until growth has been established. Final thought, interesting statistic, that if the top 10% and mostly the top 1% paid 20% of the value of their wealth and property, not even of their income, it would pay off the deficit. It would solve the deficit at a stroke. And when YouGov took a poll on that recommendation, not surprisingly, 74% of people thought it was a very good idea. Now it seems to me that you need, through this process, which is a fascinating one, to turn your protest into a strong, constructive political movement that really continues to make its voice heard. And if you do, you can move mountains. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Polly. Okay, we've got our next speaker, and that's Jonathan Portes, Director of the National Institute of Economics and Social Research. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the Tent City University and to Polly for inviting me. Hope that's a bit better. I hope you can all hear me. I don't have any answers to the exam question that we were posed about where we go from here. I have some thoughts, but first I thought I'd just say a little bit about how I think we got here, how we got into this mess. Because I think in order to understand how we might get out of it and where we might go, it's important to understand where this came from, and some of the mistakes that were made, not just in government but much more widely over the last 10 years or so. So I was a civil servant. I was an economist working in government for most of the last decade. I only left about 6 or 8 months ago. And when we saw the banks and the financial sector expanding their share of the economy, when we saw the amazing amounts that bankers were paying to themselves in salaries and bonuses, I think our reaction within government and within the political system as a whole was largely to say, on the whole, well, they probably are earning a bit too much, and it's, we don't like it any more than the rest of the population, but there's not a lot you can do about it. It's an essential part of a modern economy in some way, and while there are obviously abuses and mistakes going on the whole, the best thing to do is to try and ensure that they pay their taxes, that the economy keeps on growing, and that the money keeps on circulating, and at least some of it feeds through from taxes into public services and down to the rest of the population. And we thought, and I thought, and I'm going to admit here that I thought that, and that I was wrong. That was the best way that to run a modern economy. But we were wrong. We simply did not see that what the bankers and the financial sector was piling up for us would, when it came down, hurt not only them, but all the rest of us, and in particular the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. And I'm going to quote a few words that are not mine, but written by somebody else. Let me quote, "The banking system is a pollutant. Systemic risk is a noxious byproduct. It endangers innocent bystanders in the wider economy. The cost to the general public for banking crises." Now, I didn't write that. As I said, that was written by a guy called Andy Haldane, who works over there. He's the executive director for financial stability at the Bank of England. I think, as Polly has said, there is now a recognition, not just in fringes, but among a large section of people like me, economists, commentators and analysts, that we did let the system go way off track, and that has damaged the economy as a whole, and that we saw that in 2008, 2009. So then what happened? Well then, actually, and maybe probably not all of you agree with me on this, but I think that the actions that the government took here, and governments around the world took here, to stop the crisis becoming a Great Depression on the lines of what happened in the 1930s, were the right thing to do. They involved, we didn't get everything right, a lot of mistakes were made, some money went to the wrong people in the right ways, but still it was actually better than the alternative, because the alternative would have been a degree of mass unemployment that we haven't seen in this country since the 1920s or 30s. So that, the bailing out of the banks and the bailing out of the system of the whole that happened in 2008, 2009, while it was unpleasant, in my view, wasn't a mistake. It was what happened next that was a mistake. It was what happened after we got out of the immediate crisis. It was the decision not to do what Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's advisor, said, which was, to turn a crisis into an opportunity, to use it as a platform for radical reform of how the financial system worked. We failed. We didn't do that. We let things go back to the normal, and instead governments around the world have turned, as Polly has said, to tackling the wrong problem. The problem of the deficit, the problem of what is perceived to be a state that is too big. And so what we're having now is, instead of proper reform of the financial sector, we are having cuts in public services and deficit that are going too far too fast. And that is, in my view, a mistake. We are on the wrong track now. I don't know, as I said at the beginning, what all the answers are. The first time I was asked what I thought about this particular event and protest was a week ago when it started, when I was appearing on Sky News, actually, to talk about the Eurozone crisis, and they introduced me with a short clip of what was happening in Rome, what was happening in Athens, and what was happening here. And they asked me, well, what do you think? I think, expecting as an economist, I would say, well, it's all totally unrealistic. But I said, as I said, I think this is shared by a lot of mainstream economists and analysts now. I said, I think people are right to be angry. People are right to be angry that we have people like Bob Diamond, not just paying himself obscene amounts of money, but paying himself obscene amounts of money that are effectively on the basis of taxpayer guarantees and taxpayer subsidies. the system allows that. That is something that people are right to be angry. And I'll say again for the final time, I don't know what the answers are, but I do know that we can't go on like this.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so our next speaker is James Meadway, Senior Economist at the NEF.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to start with a bit of context, which looks like this. I think when people look back on 2011 and everything that has happened this year, it will stand out in the way that 1848 or 1917 or 1968 stands out as a year of great upheaval, a year that started with a revolution in Egypt that has seen throughout the months of this year, right across the world, people everywhere standing up and saying, we will not be ruled in the old way. And at the same time, as is becoming clear, and as Jonathan said, the people who rule us finding that they cannot continue to rule in the old way. That is why 2011 is so important. That, I think, is why what we're doing here is so important. Because I've essentially lived all my life, 31 now, and I think probably it's a similar age to some of the crowd here, lived all my life under a set of ideas that started in this country really with Margaret Thatcher, that spread throughout the world, Reagan in the US, but also going into Europe, Australia, anywhere you care to look. A set of ideas that got called neoliberalism, that said, and have said for 30 years or more, that it's not possible to run the economy on the basis of democracy, on the basis of what people want, and that the only way to run this society and this economy is on the basis of the free market. And what we've reached now is the end point, I think, of that set of ideas and of that way of running the world, because we know what it produces. This country has been a laboratory for what happens when you allow neoliberalism as a set of ideas, as a set of economic policies, as a way of running the world to flourish. We've been a laboratory. For 10 years, Polly mentioned some of it, we've had essentially stagnant or declining living standards. We've had people's wages actually falling, unprecedented since the end of the Second World War, and that has been compensated by simply layering debt after debt after debt on top of them. So we had for 10 years a boom of sorts. Gordon Brown was very proud of it at the time, fueled entirely by debt and by credit. And when that system collapsed in 2008, that's when the crisis really started to break through, when it became clear that right across the world, the debt that had been built up was not going to be repaid, that if you look to the US, the subprime mortgage scandal, and it is a scandal, these are poor, desperate people being missold mortgages they could never pay by cowboys who were themselves financed by the big banks, when it turned out, lo and behold, from 2006, 2007 onwards, that people without a job, without any income, without any asset, couldn't in fact pay the mortgages they'd been missold. The entire system started to shake. And Lehman Brothers, which was as entangled in this scandal as any other major investment bank, filed for bankruptcy, threatened the world economy. It was clear then that neoliberalism should have run its course. And what we had instead was a response that looked like this, again starting in this country. The bailouts. Now the estimate that the nice people opposite give you for the cost of this, Mervyn King quotes this figure, he's the governor of the Bank of England, is that this cost this country essentially £1.3 trillion. That is the reason. The financial crisis, the bailouts and the recession that started is the reason that the debt has increased. Not just here, but right the way across the developed world. That is the only reason national debt has increased. And it is a lie. It is a simple, straight up lie to be told that the reason we must now have austerity, the reason the debt has increased, is because we built too many hospitals. We educated too many children. It is an absolute flat out lie. And one of the things that this has achieved, that this occupation has achieved, like
what happened in Wall Street is starting to break open that lie, because everyone knows it really. They know full well if you pay for teachers and nurses and students, it doesn't turn into a financial crisis. A financial crisis starts because of what these people do, not because of what we do. So we have to say from this, we oppose the cuts because frankly I think it's immoral. It's immoral to say that a crisis that ordinary people, all of us lot, did not start. It's immoral to say that we should have to pay for it. The people who should pay for it are the people who started it. That means the financial system. But there's another part to this, and this is where I might disagree slightly with Jonathan, is that, look, it's all very well saying we had the bailouts, we kept the financial system going, and all right, fine, the debt has increased everywhere as a result. This is kind of the mechanism. Look what's happening, and this is the epicenter of the crisis now. Look what's happening inside the Eurozone. Don't believe this nonsense about Greece is in trouble because it too spent too much on hospitals, schools, public services. Absolute rubbish. Greece spends less, actually, as a percentage of GDP on public services than does Germany, for example. It's a low-spending, relatively low-spending economy inside the European Union. And Greeks, incidentally, are certainly not lazy. They work some of the longest hours in the OECD. Only South Korea works longer hours than people in Greece do. It's a whole load of nonsense about this is all Greece's problem. It's not. It's a systemic problem, and it's a systemic problem that has been engendered by the financial crisis. So be clear about the mechanism here, because Sarkozy and Merkel and all the rest of it, well, they're not going to reach an agreement this weekend, they're probably not going to reach an agreement on Wednesday, they can flap about. But the thing they can't address is that systemic problem, and it looks like this. The financial crisis broke out. The response was the bailouts, and the response was a massive increase in national debts everywhere, including Greece. That national debt is then held inside the European financial system. So the debt of Greece is sitting inside European banks, some of them based in Greece, but a very large number in France and Germany. So if Greece looks like it can't repay its debt, that threatens French and German banks. Already a relatively small Belgian bank, Dexia, has nearly bankrupted itself because of the debt, the Greek debt that it holds. So in other words, the attempt to deal with the crisis that we saw in 2008-2009, the bailouts, the sudden increase in expenditure in some places, the increase in sovereign debt is feeding straight back into the financial system. So by trying to deal with the financial crisis before, we've created a crisis of sovereign debt that is now threatening a further financial crisis. In other words, we've gone from a situation of seeing only a crisis of private finance into one where there's a crisis on the public balance sheets, particularly inside the Eurozone, that is now threatening to turn back into a private crisis, a private financial crisis. Everything is joining together, and that is the severity of the situation that we're now in. And that's why something like this is so critical, because I do not believe, if you look at the miserable bunch currently running this country, or anywhere else in Europe, if you look at them, and between them, the only responses they have to a deep systemic crisis of capitalism is to say, we must have austerity, we must just make cuts, we have to get rid of the deficit. And when they know, or at least they ought to know, that that is precisely what governments tried to do in the 1930s, and that is precisely why that financial crisis, that recession turned into the Great Depression, by trying to pay back, so-called, the deficit, by trying to make spending cuts, you wreck an economy, you shatter people's lives, and you wreck the entire economy. And that's now what we're heading into. So we have to make a break with that. We should say we oppose the cuts, but we also have to break the mechanism that's starting to force those cuts, the deadlock between private financial crisis and state debt. That, I think, means not just reform of the financial system, but a transformation of it. Now, I'm not going to stand here and start to give chapter and verse on what we might do, because I think actually one of the things we started to do in the Occupy movement is at least pose the questions and then see what answers we get to. But I think it fundamentally revolves around the issue of democracy. Take the Bank of England. Take the Bank of England. It is run by something called the Monetary Policy Committee. The Monetary Policy Committee is elected by no one. This is deliberate. New Labour did this in 1997. They said we want an independent Bank of England. Now that's independent in one sense and one sense only. That means independent of any democratic control, but it means completely dependent on the city. go through the people on the Monetary Policy Committee. So one of the demands we must start to raise is, how do we democratise our financial system? How do we take the banks, which we own, by the way? We own RBS, we own Lloyds Banking Group, we own them. How do we take them from being run in the interests of the 1%, because that's what they are? How do we take them and run them in the interests of the 99%? Why is it that the resources of what is still a very big financial system is not being used to provide the things that people actually want and need? Why are students being asked to fork out £9,000 a year in tuition fees? Why is it that schools are stopped being built? Why is it that hospitals are still run down? Why is it that all this wealth is not being used through our financial system to provide the things that people want and need? And that, fundamentally, addressing that question is about democracy. It's about, how do we control democratically, on the basis of planning, the resources of the society and the economy we live in. Now that is a deeply complicated question. That is not something that can be answered either by me or anybody else here. But what we've done, and if we achieve nothing else out of this Occupy movement, we've at least started to create the idea that neoliberalism, the assault on democracy that it involves, the idea that the economy is just this technical separate thing that only economists and accountants are allowed to know about, is wrong, and it's ours, and we need to reclaim it. That's what we need to talk about.
Thank you, James. And next we have John Christensen, Director of the Tax Justice Institute.
We were just talking about Greece, and last weekend I was in Jersey, my home island, with a Greek documentary team. One of the reasons why Greece has been so heavily in debt for such a long time is because their money doesn't sit in Greek banks, it sits offshore. Much of it sitting here in London, much of it sitting in my home island in Jersey, or in the British Virgin Islands, or in the Cayman Islands. The reason why Greece has had to rely so heavily on debt for the last 40 years is because all of their wealthy companies, all of their wealthy people have shifted their money offshore to places like London and don't pay tax. So who pays tax in Greece? It's the teachers, it's the nurses, it's the ordinary people, a bit like here in Britain. The same applies in Britain, of course. Our powerful companies don't pay any tax. Our rich people don't pay any tax, or pay very little tax. The assumption that if you pay bankers huge sums of money and then tax them back doesn't hold water, because most of them actually get paid their bonuses through offshore structures. We're actually sitting in an offshore tax haven at the moment. The City of London is actually quite offshore. Politically, it's run by the Corporation of London. The Corporation of London is like no other democracy anywhere in the world. There are only 7,000 people who are physical electors living within the square mile where we are at the moment. The vast majority of the electors of the City of London Corporation are companies. This is a democracy where companies have votes. The more people they employ, the more votes they have. The end result is you have a democracy called the City of London Corporation, which is run by business, by capital, on behalf of capital. This is fundamentally anti-democratic. It gets worse. They have their own police force, they have their own standing army. When the Queen wants to visit the City of London, she has to stop at the boundaries and come under the protection of the City of London Corporation. So one of the things we need to do is to reclaim the city, and there is actually a group here called Reclaim the City, and they're organising actions later in November around reclaiming democracy in the City of London. But if we are to reclaim democracy, we're going to have to tackle what I think is one of the fundamental issues, one of the fundamental problems we all face. And that is that since the 1950s, the banks have by and large been operating offshore. And I'm going to explain what I mean by offshore. Thank you. In 1955, an extraordinary decision was taken over there in the Bank of England. The decision was to ignore a bond issued by Midland Bank just round the corner. Midland Bank had their headquarters then just round the corner, 150 metres from where I'm standing. The bond was a dollar bond. The significance of this was at that time all financial activities were strongly controlled under the Bretton Woods Agreement. Capital exchange, capital controls were in place, and central banks were responsible for regulating banking activities. Over there, for some reason, perhaps over a cup of tea, they said, well, we're not going to control this particular bond issue because it's in dollars. We don't mind about dollar issues. They suddenly deregulated a whole area of banking activity and opened up what we now call the euro-dollar market. So these euro-dollar markets became global. By the mid-1960s, they were trading in hundreds of billions. Now they trade in trillions every single day. A totally unregulated and largely untaxed market. Why stop here, thought the banks as they began to develop this market within London. Why don't we create our own little escape holes where we can live beyond democratic control, beyond regulation, we can do whatever we want. These are the places we all know and love as tax havens. Places like Jersey, Bermuda, Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Switzerland. And you'll be familiar with them because almost every single day of the week, when you listen to the Today programme on Radio 4, who listens to Today programme? John Humphreys and his crowd talking about why we must make so many concessions to business. Every morning at about 6:20 they'll have someone from the city talking about the markets, and that person will say, we must deregulate London, because if we don't deregulate London, all this talent from the City of London will leave and go to Switzerland and go to Luxembourg, and we'll miss them and our economy will suffer. And so successive governments, whether it's Labour or Liberal Democrat or Conservatives, say, oh well, we can't have that. We must make them concessions, we must cut their taxes, we must deregulate, whatever they do to keep the bankers here, because we have no other economy left, because the bankers here are so good, they destroyed the rest of our manufacturing base. Now the trouble with the offshore economy is it's systemic. It runs right the way through the world. It's become massive. The vast majority of world trade, the vast majority of world investment, cross-border investment, the vast majority of wealth is now held in tax havens or goes through tax havens. We're about to finalize some research into how much money actually is held. Private money is held offshore in tax havens. And the figures which are being worked up at the moment in New York are somewhere between 22 to 25 trillion US dollars of private wealth held offshore, tax evading. A trillion is 1 million million, so we're talking here about 22 to 25 millions of dollars, including Greek money, Italian money, British money, American money, African money, held offshore. And that perhaps explains to you why we pay more tax, why the tax charge is being shifted away from capital onto us through higher VAT, cuts in exemptions, cuts in services, because the rich are paying less, corporations are paying less, we're paying more. Now, the sad truth is the vast majority of the tax havens are either British, American or European. The impact of these places on developing countries is catastrophic. Greece is just one example. My friends at Christian Aid have produced very good case studies of how the vast majority of Zambia's wealth from copper mining is shifted out of Zambia and turns up in Switzerland, which turns Switzerland apparently into the biggest copper trading country in the world. How did that happen? It happened because of a colossal systemic failure. Yeah, we do have a colossal systemic failure at a global level. We have to completely reform the International Monetary Fund, completely reform the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the World Bank, and others. But I think it begins here in Britain, because I spend a lot of my time talking with the IMF, observing them, observing the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development and the UN. And the one country which spends all of its efforts blocking reform, and has been doing this since the 1950s, is Britain. And I'm thoroughly ashamed of Britain's role in blocking international progress. And I want to give you an example of why I think we have become one of the most corrupt countries in the world. I came back to England as the riots were building up in August. And at that time, some very interesting discussions were underway. Germany had just started to make a deal with the Swiss government, whereby they were going to allow their tax evaders who've been using Switzerland to get away scot-free. They weren't going to investigate, they weren't going to prosecute, and they weren't going to put these criminals into prison. And they are criminals, and many of them are from the very highest elite of German society. And as I came back to Britain at the time of the riots, I heard that the British government were doing exactly the same thing. We have evidence of over 6,000 of Britain's highest elites who have been using Swiss banks to evade tax. One of those banks, by the way, is a British bank, HSBC, organised criminal organisation, which has been involved through its Geneva Bank in enabling people to evade taxes on a systemic basis across the world for donkey's years. Their chief executive of that branch, Stephen Green, Reverend Stephen Green, Lord Reverend Stephen Green, is a senior advisor to the current government. He was chief executive of this criminal organisation that was enabling British people at the very highest level to evade tens of millions, possibly billions of pounds every year. So at the time when the Prime Minister was saying, we will investigate, we will prosecute, and we will punish the looters in London, he was doing a deal with the Swiss banks to do exactly the precise opposite with Britain's wealthy elites. We will not investigate, we will not prosecute, we will not criminalise these people, we will do a deal to let them get away with this. These people are the most privileged, the wealthiest of our society. They are criminal, they belong in jail, but we're going to let them off. But worse than that, this deal is designed to undermine international attempts to tackle tax evasion. It is Britain's attempt to protect its own tax haven economy, which is much bigger than the Swiss economy. I think one of the reasons we've got to take to the streets is because Britain has become deeply corrupted by our banks, many of which are criminal organisations. We've got to tackle the tax haven economy. We've got to democratise the City of London Corporation. We've got to democratise the Bank of England, and we've got to overcome this criminal instinct within our bankers. Thank you very much, and good luck to you.
Twitter. Our Twitter account is Tent City Uni, so we're constantly tweeting everything that's going on, trying to kind of spread the education further than just this place. Also, hashtag for this event is TCU Teach Out. Also, people that aren't here as well, if you can encourage them to tweet in their questions to us, and then I can pick them up and we can, yeah, hopefully make this education spread a lot further than just the people that can be present today. Thank you.
Hand over here.
Narrow financial interests. We've got a series of concrete demands, and if anyone is interested in joining us, we're going to be here on the Lord Mayor's Show, 12th of November, right here, 11 AM, to present those demands and to have our own alternative Lord's Mayor parade to the steps of St Paul's to acclaim an alternative Lord Mayor for the people, if anyone wants to get involved in that. I think people need to realise that one of the reasons the church are so stressed about the occupation tax,
I think that, I mean, I have mixed feelings. The economists are sort of mixed about whether it would have the right effects or not. I think one needs to perhaps have a slightly broader perspective. A financial transaction tax might or might not be part of the solution, but you actually need a system of taxation and regulation that ensures that the financial sector as a whole doesn't make the excessive profits that it has been making and passing it on to its senior management, traders and employees in the way that it has. I'm not convinced a financial transaction tax, certainly on its own, would be enough to do that. One actually needs to step back and think, what is the system of regulation and taxation that means that the financial sector produces profits and produces goods and services for the rest of the economy in the same way that other better regulated, more productive industries actually do. What is it? How do you structure the system, the regulation system as well as the taxation system, so that finance works for the economy and not the other way around?
My own view about the financial transaction tax is it may not be perfect, but it is what's on offer. It's what the French and Germans want to do, and it's what's there on the table now. It may, as Jonathan says, there may be lots of other things that should go with it, but it is Britain, and Britain as the main opposition, that is preventing this happening, and that's particularly shameful in the European context. I wanted to say something to our friend here about the press. I think I've never heard anybody complain before that the British press is too fair and balanced. I'm kind of gobsmacked.
Fair and balanced.
Fair and balanced. We have a press in this country that has been at the root of our political problems and our political strangeness since the 1930s, since the days of Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Northcliffe. We have had a media that has been run by usually 3 or 4 exceedingly eccentric, often foreign billionaires who have used the press for their own political motives, whether it was Lord Beaverbrook or Lord Northcliffe or whoever. We have an 80% very right-wing press in this country. I mean, further to the right than the sort of average Conservative Party member would be. And they have manipulated the politics of this country for decades. I mean, The Guardian is independent. We're lucky. We are a trust. We don't have an owner. I regard The Independent as a pretty fair-minded newspaper. I think the Financial Times is an interestingly fair-minded newspaper in all kinds of ways. Most of our press is grossly distorted. Most of the problem we're in is that every time anybody suggests, as you are all doing, new ways of doing things, 80% of the press goes out there and says, you're all completely crazy. And we know that's not true.
Okay.
It's a really important point. Very quickly.
I just wanted to come back on that because this is a really important point. Yes, The Guardian and The Independent are much, much better than most of the others, but we need to ask the very simple question, why is the majority of the media in the most neoliberalised countries to the right of most of the voters? It's because that political, ideological framework suits the interests of the corporations that pay for it. And I think the figure on average is roughly 80% corporate funding via advertising for print and TV media now. And this is the huge issue, and it's a huge issue for The Guardian as well as others. And I think we need to recognise that it is a systemic problem. Yes, the billionaires with their own agendas are a massive part of the problem, but quite simply, if you're paid for by certain interests, you do not criticise those interests systematically. And a systematic critique of the power of money in creating this undemocracy that is centred here in the city is the problem that we need to be engaging with.
Well said. Okay, so guys, we've got 45 minutes left for this session, right? And I'm deeply aware, as are others, that it's going to be very, very difficult to balance getting everyone that wants to ask a question or make a point publicly and having the breakout sessions. So we figured that in true, real democratic spirit, we would put it to you guys. Can we reach a consensus on either remaining here and continuing with the Q&A, or going to the breakout sessions and then coming back and feeding back to the group? So basically, if you vote for us staying here and continuing this, can I have hands? Sorry, I actually didn't see that. Can you do that again? And can I have hands for breakout sessions? Okay. I feel like it's pretty overwhelming that we stay here, so we'll continue with the questions. And there's a hand that has been shot up straight into the air, so please come up.
I'm not going to take a lot of time, and all the points that have been made up here have been very valid. But the one thing we haven't discussed is the inherent weakness of our debt-based monetary system. And this isn't a recent problem, it's evolved over 300 years. And that is the root cause. The debt that we talk about is actually money. Money is created as debt. The bank doesn't have any money. They create it as debt. If we pay off the debt, there is no money. That's what happened in 1929 when the Depression took hold in America. What we have is a fundamentally rotten banking system. It is legalized fraud. They are lending money that doesn't exist. They're charging interest. The volume of interest grows, but they don't create the money to pay back the interest. And so where does the money come from? They have to create more debt to actually create the money to pay off the original interest. But then that leads to more interest to be paid. So the fundamental root cause, it underpins the military-industrial complex, finances wars around the globe. Without perpetual war, then the military-industrial complex can't survive. It corrupts our politics, it corrupts our media, it corrupts our public institutions. And worst of all, many of us here today are worried about sustainability. Everybody talks about a return to growth, and this beast of a debt-based monetary system relies on an economic system that must have growth. And when you hear modest numbers of 3%, that is illusory. What they're talking about is 3% on last year, and then next year it's 3% more. That is an exponential curve. So the only way this economic system can survive is by raping the world of all its resources. And it's the banking system at the root of it. And everything else is a distraction, it's a symptom. It's all important, and people need to be fed, and we need to have our public services, but if we want to get to the heart of the beast, it is the banking system, the debt-based monetary system. Google on money as debt and educate yourselves. If 99% understood the debt-based monetary system, this movement will be unstoppable. Sorry, that's it.
Looks like we're divided on the financially, whilst there are arguments against a financial transaction tax, there are arguments against all types of taxes, including value-added taxes, which are regressive, income taxes, which impact upon employment, and so on. All taxes, in one way or another, have their little problems. The advantage of financial transaction taxes is actually relatively easy to collect. It would help dampen down speculative trades, and that's a very important part of the process. But why stop with financial transaction taxes? There are other taxes which could be introduced to tackle the huge wealth and income disparities in this country. This country has an extraordinary concentration of land ownership in the hands of a very tiny minority of less than 5,000 families own over 60% of the land in including in London, and a land value tax would do a huge amount to reduce their, not just their wealth, but also their power within the political process. So why stop with the land value tax? Let's move on to progressive income taxes. I'd just like to point out, and I said this other day for those of you who had the misfortune to be at the university down at St Paul's with me the other day, the period when capitalism had its heyday in the 1950s, 1960s and early 1970s, when growth, inequality, and so inequality was brought down to the lowest levels ever, where growth was sustained at way above the average of the last 30 years. That period coincided with a period when there was a massive redistribution of wealth through the tax system, and marginal taxes on the wealthy were running at over 90%. Did the wealthy retreat to Switzerland? No, they didn't, because there was a lot of money to be made here in Britain at that time. So I have no problems whatsoever with talking about a progressive tax system, because I think it's in our interests. So progressive income taxes, bring capital gains tax back up to the level where it's on parity with income tax, because otherwise it's very, very easy for our learned friends here to dress income up as capital gains and avoid paying tax. All of the games that are played by the banks around avoiding tax need to be closed down. So let's have a financial transaction tax, let's have a land value tax, let's have regroup around the idea of progressive income taxes. Let's cut out all the tax exemptions whereby some of my mates, I live out in Buckinghamshire, and half of my mates seem to spend half their time playing golf on tax exemptions and buying themselves Porsches. I don't understand this. Why are we subsidising people in this way? Way beyond me. Our tax system needs to be made progressive again, and there's a lot we can do to tackle power whilst we're doing that.
Personally happy to see how many hands were clapping at the word redistribution there. Other questions? Yeah. Come.
I just want to say how incredibly exciting I think it's been. 2011, a year of mass resistance, revolutions, sweeping across the Arab world, and also, the emergence now of a new global anti-capitalist movement is unbelievable. And I think what is really important to stress is how this new movement isn't coming from nowhere. It's coming from the fact that ordinary people's lives globally are being destroyed by the capitalists and by the ruling classes, and by vicious austerity measures. In America alone, $18 trillion of cuts being put through over the next 10 years to a system where already people live in barbaric conditions. You look at the nature of the healthcare system in the States. New Orleans, the infant mortality rate is that of the Gaza Strip. It's absolutely horrific conditions for people, and horrible, very difficult to get education and so on and so forth. And I think that's what's really important then, is to look at how do we fight back and how do we resist. And one of the most exciting things around the Occupy Wall Street movement has been the emergence of the ability for the movement to connect with the organized working class. Because I think there you see in the working class the ability to actually cut off at the point of production. The idea of strikes, and in Greece we've just seen 48-hour general strike yesterday. Massive solidarity to all those in Greece. And also here we're about to see on 30th of November 3 million public sector workers go out on strike. This will be the biggest strike in British history since 1926 general strike, and everybody here, I know it's brilliant, has backed it as well. And I think it's important that we make plans now on how we'll bring solidarity on that day and see how those people who create things, the 99%, have the ability to shut everything down. Occupy Wall Street has backed the call for general strike. I think we should do the same here.
Warming words for a very, very cold day. I see the cold has siphoned off some of our number, so if some of you at the back want to come and join in a slightly warmer huddle, then that might be great. There's a hand here.